Hello and welcome to the ANF podcast with me, Al Coates, and him. Actually, Scott's not here. Scott's away on his holidays, as per usual. So, I'm putting an introduction onto this episode without him and we'll let it speak for itself. But before Christmas, we managed to speak to a post-adoption social worker, Nick. We've always struggled to get practicing social workers to come on the podcast, and there's a whole host of reasons around that. But Nick was really open and honest and willing to come on, but wanted to reiterate that the views expressed here are personal only. We chat through a huge range of issues that are facing and pressing on contemporary adoption, and Nick was absolutely fantastic, open and honest, and cast a light into some of the stuff that we always kind of talk around and look at. Now, as always, if you have experience of adoption, fostering or special guardianship from any perspective, personal or professional, would like to share that on the podcast, please do get in touch. You can get in touch through the Facebook page, Twitter, or you can email us at aandfpodcast@gmail.com. So today we're really privileged to speak to a post-adoption support worker, which is quite unusual for us. So I'd like to introduce our guest, Nick Burke. Hello, Nick.
Hi.
So Nick, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the work you do? And then we're going to get into it and we're going to ask you some questions because we're really, as we keep saying, we've never really had a post-adoption support worker on the podcast, especially one who's practicing now. So fire away. Tell us about yourself.
Okay, so I am a social worker who has had 15 years of experience in child protection and post-adoption. And I think when I came to post-adoption social work, I had a very different idea of what adoption was, of what the support might be. And I think, I like a lot of people, I kind of saw adoption as a fresh start. And I thought that, a bit of support and perhaps some therapy for the child would be kind of what people would need. And then within their new loving family, all would be well. Like that was my kind of view of things. And I think that's changed quite a lot from just learning from people that I've had the privilege to support in this area. So
can I ask you why, they're not natural bedfellows. Well, maybe they are. Child protection to post-adoption support. How did that link happen? What sort of led you to that team?
It's quite a problematic story because when I was working in child protection, I became interested in an approach to attachment, which I now really hate. Which is right. So there's this kind of subgroup of attachment practitioners who kind of see disorganized attachment as somehow like a predictor of child abuse. So it's very problematic. So they're trying to read backwards from a child's behaviour to kind of pin that with parents. So it's very, very parent blaming and but it's like the holy grail for child protection social workers because they think, wow, I've got this way of like understanding. I can see what this child's doing. It must be the parents. So that kind of child protection culture, that very problematic thing got me interested in digging deeper into attachment theory,
right,
and understanding more about like how like it's actually really messy and dynamic and things change and relationships change and it's not clean. It's not the case that it's just not simple at all. But I was interested in kind of therapeutic stuff around that, and it wasn't really matching with working in child protection social work, where it's very process driven and you just have to it's about like following a process and things like that, and there's not much scope for kind of working with people in detail. So I wanted to work with people in more detail and that kind of thing. That's why I moved into post-adoption.
And I guess post-adoption is an area where that whole attachment issue is quite well known, isn't it? It's sort of, well, it used to be. I don't think maybe 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, it was the bread and butter of post-adoption support, wasn't it? If you understood attachment, it was very much the parlance of families, but maybe we've moved on to trauma now. But that's for another discussion. So you join a post-adoption support team. Right. Tell me, how does that go down?
I was very surprised, like in the field, because, and I mean, post-adoption support is very different depending on where you live. There's a bit of a postcode lottery. I mean, that might be changing now that more local authorities are part of regionalised agencies. So there may be some more kind of standardised things coming in, but it can be from anything from one person who does a bit of post-adoption support on the side and is really an adoption social worker recruiting adopters, to like a supportive multidisciplinary team and everything in between. So I think my experiences were social workers coming into that work, and where I work, it's very hands-on, and we do have supportive relationships with people over time. But what were the tools they had available to them? They were the child protection tools based on understanding the difficulties of a child based on what the parents are doing, so that had the same dilemma essentially that I had in child protection, that the kind of frameworks to explain what was happening were still kind of very parent blaming and not understanding the whole messy thing in context. So I had a bit of a culture shock really moving there and moving into the field and trying to make sense of this.
So was that just you? I mean, just you, because I can imagine coming from a child protection, you look forward and think, well, I'm moving into post-adoption support, but actually the tools and equipment, the old adage, is it Maslow's hammer? The only tool you've got is a hammer, every problem is a nail. And so was it unusual as well? Because I often think the difference between working with, I suppose child protection is predominantly vulnerable families, in the sense of socioeconomic, in all of the challenges that they may face as families. That's not necessarily present in adoptive parents. Is there a sort of a total gear shift as you move into working with a different type of adult as well?
Yeah, but some of that actually opens up opportunities, because it can be the case that you've got people really determined to do therapeutic parenting, and perhaps finding that on its own isn't enough either. But like, you can be alongside them in that struggle. I think in child protection, there are barriers to that. Like, that is more difficult. If you're saying, I'm here because this is a compulsory child protection plan and I want to work alongside you, like, why would they trust that? So it's more often in post-adoption support that people can trust that you're there to try to work with them and be alongside them. And that should be happening more in child protection as well. That's a big difference. I think there's space as well to be more creative, because we're slightly out of the limelight. So we can do more different creative things with families. So I can go on bike rides with young people to get to know them before I start to ask them lots of detailed questions. Or I can use some theraplay techniques with somebody, alongside my kind of, when I'm visiting, to just kind of try to connect. Whereas in child protection, there wasn't the space for that kind of thing.
I'm going to stop asking questions for a second, because Scott is...
Shock horror, because I've not even said I'm here. So anybody listening, do apologise. I'm here. I've been here all along, but I'll get so excited when one of his own comes on the podcast. Which is
one of my own.
So whilst Al's had lots of interesting questions, I want to just rewind back a little bit, because you mentioned when you opened there about when you joined, when you first got into adoption support, and how I just wanted to ask you, so did you, I'm not saying that, I'm not putting words in your mouth or anything, but your impressions of what the job was going to be like versus what the actual job is, what I mean, I'm assuming it's quite a spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, there's every different kind of weird and wonderful adoptive parent that we might work with, there's also every different kind of weird and wonderful work. Well, I'm weird, so there's every kind of weird and wonderful social worker.
Yeah,
and so you will get very institutionalized, narrow-focused social workers who, and then you'll get a whole range.
Yeah.
So I think I saw that and didn't expect to.
Yeah. So what's your impression of like adoption? You briefly touched on it, but was it like that still the traditional kind of adoption narrative that you had in your head when you first joined? Because we're talking 15 years ago, so that's quite, 15 years being a social worker, I think you said.
Yeah, so it's maybe half and half child protection and post-adoption.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that a lot the people I really learned from is young people. I mean, one thing I wanted to say. So there's an idea. I'm a non-binary social worker, and there's an idea that medicalizes gender and says that gender dysmorphia is like an individual medical thing rather than something that's wrong with the whole of society. And I think you could extend that in the same way to like adoption, like understanding adoption and life story. People like see a child and they say like, well, they pathologize a child or a family and say they're not. Whereas actually often the young people that I've worked with have been really good at asking big questions or trying to get to grips with big questions. And it's the people around them who are panicking and not knowing how to do this and not knowing how to hold that emotionally or how to allow them to experience something and do some emotional and therapeutic work around it and contain that and be with them. And that really affects things like sibling relationships, meeting up with birth siblings and the people around them thinking, how is this going to work? How are they going to manage it? And I think listening to young people now, young adopted people who are at much younger ages starting to kind of explore their identity and challenge things has been a massive eye-opener for me.
Because we last year we ran a conference about looking specifically at identity, and I think it was I think we were really blown away by the complexity. I mean, we know it's a complicated time being a teenager and identity formation, but just the layers that then is added by children's pre-care experience, care experience, and adoption experience, and the complicated narratives of maintaining links just mean that what is sort of universally accepted as a difficult time, working out who you are, is then these huge other issues are sort of poured into that bucket. And so is that an issue that you see a lot of families looking for support around? Yeah,
definitely. And sometimes it's, it's the kind of classic thing. So transitioning to secondary school, starting to explore things, but that often now comes with getting really social media literate, starting to and I think there's a really problematic and traditional view of social media that basically sees it as like entirely through the lens of safety and terrified about the possibility of kind of exploring wider family and understanding kind of that kind of stuff. And I think young people are like way ahead of us with this. We need to listen to them and listen to what they're telling us they need and find helpful, safe ways for them to explore that. And I think, we're starting to, there's some slow change, like starting to learn some of that, but the adoption system's quite kind of set in its ways sometimes. So like some of that slow progress.
So say what you really think.
And it's interesting because you bring up the kind of gender and sexuality thing as well. With COVID, and I certainly have personal experience of this. I mean, as a gay man, I'm quite open to, I'm very open to everything. But I've learned so much from my son my 16-year-old. As a result of COVID, identity was a really big thing because obviously not mixing with his peers, and not having a sense of who he was, all that sort of stuff through the lockdowns, not being able to mix with his friends. And we have had a number of conversations about gender and gender fluidity and stuff like that. I've learned like loads, but he's also learned loads from us because we've gone on training courses, which I know might sound stupid, but it's to make sure that we're aware, as the jobs that we do, to make sure that we are welcoming, that we're open and stuff. How do you feel that's affected and impacted? Because I know you've done some work on COVID-19, haven't you, on social work? But how do you think that has impacted things like identity and coming out the other side now? I can see you nodding.
It's really difficult because, I mean, it's difficult because it's hard to see this without. There was a narrative coming from the Department for Education through the whole thing about kind of the poor children. They need to go back to school, and we saw a really polarised thing in post-adoption support. So, some neurodiverse children who found school really challenging, actually, that lockdown one was like a calm space where they could recover, spend time with their parents, and like all that kind of nurturing stuff was possible. So it became polarized. So then you also had young people, especially child-to-parent violence, like much more intense support needs. And both of those connect to like what you need to do as a teenager, which is like trying to define yourself as an individual separate to your parents, and then you're just locked in this situation. Yeah. So yeah, definitely, there were big challenges around COVID, and it's funny because as social workers, like in COVID, everyone else disappeared. Like we were still there supporting families, but kind of like a lot of the other professionals kind of stopped kind of visiting and things like that. But I think there was a missed opportunity to work differently and promote like collective approaches. It was still individual casework. And I think across adoption, that's one lesson for me. Like we need to do much more kind of community and collective and group work, social work. And rather than kind of case-based, using the systems of child protection social work.
Yeah, because our local CAMs, obviously we use our local CAMs here. It's a little bit different to the UK because we're in Ireland, so they're actually, our local CAMs is good. But the clinical psychologist who we see, she actually shared with us that they've had an increase in the number of children and young people who are coming forward as identifying as trans or non-binary as a result of the lockdowns and stuff. And I guess we're not going to know for a few years as to how that's going to go. I mean, are you finding the same kind of thing?
Definitely. And like there's definitely a kind of social gender dysmorphia around the child often. Yeah. Where people don't know, where the child knows how to express this and nobody else knows how to make sense of it. So yes, but I think also it's quite a toxic atmosphere. And I'm not saying like the professionals I work with are great, but it's more like what's coming from the government and the idea that like, you can't support social transition for prepubertal children, and in order to access hormones, you have to now sign up to be part of a clinical trial. Like these are big kind of, it's culture war. It's actually culture war, but it's messing with people's lives in quite big ways. So I think that being able to listen to and understand young people and be alongside them is the role of the social worker in that situation. And there's a lot of advocacy involved in that as well. But young people are amazing. Anyone who writes off young people, like, you're totally wrong. They're challenging everything, and They're fantastic.
They are. They're just and to be fair, they're not too different to, like the kind of the LGB kind of thing from the 70s and 80s that were challenging. It's just a different way now, isn't it? And also the kind of people are becoming more aware of it. And I guess Al and I have never really ventured into that arena. I think there's a certain element of fear for us anyway, of getting it wrong rather than discussing it. It's not about not discussing it, it's about getting it wrong, So and you are the first self-identifying non-binary person that we've had on the podcast, so
which
so we might get it wrong. If we do, we hold our hands up. We're very much about language, so the correct language, so just putting that in the middle of there.
But I think that, reflecting on my own experience as an adoptive parent, in many regards, this wasn't on my agenda. My children's, that's maybe because I'm a straight white man, right? So yeah, let's just, I am a straight white man.
Probably.
Yeah, probably. But what my children have taken me on a really interesting journey, because my experience is, my job as a dad is just to accept them for who they are, full stop, and love them, support them, keep them safe, put a few guardrails in. But what I realized was that there was and I guess if we go back to the identity, is that their identity formation is so much more complex than my experience and my peers' children's experience. And I think it's an issue that can often be that we don't necessarily address in adoption preparation, because I think that our children are going to struggle with their identity, even if they go around the houses and come back to say, I'm a straight white boy or I'm a straight white girl. That doesn't mean there won't be a struggle on the way. And so do you think that the preparation... I've found a question in there. It's excellent. Phew. So do you think that we're preparing adopters appropriately for actually what is coming?
My view is that, so it's quite easy to say we need more of this in the training, but my view is that we need to have more, we need to offer regular check-ins, like through the kind of life cycle of adoptive family life. Like, some people might not take that up, but I think it's very difficult to kind of cover a lot of things in training when the focus that people have is very different to what they then might start to open up and have. So, and that applies to gender. That also applies to family time and connecting with birth siblings and things like that. Like those things are not. They need to be on the radar in the initial training, because I think we should be saying to people, you are adopting a family, not just a child. Like, you're adopting a whole world that is connected to this child. But also, I think that needs to be revisited later with people, because it's really difficult.
No, I think that's probably what we hear expressed a lot, is that, you are focused on a 4-year-old that's coming.
Yeah.
But they will be 14. And the issues will have changed palpably, and you're not necessarily in a position to absorb that. Do you and I can tell you, being careful not to kind of, because you are a practicing social worker, so you've got an employer, you've got a registration, so you've got to be, careful. It's only prudent and wise. Have you done your registration? It's today. Just checking. I
have, yes, today.
That's right. Okay, interesting. Get your CPD in. Okay, it was a great podcast, but I lost my registration.
Yeah. It's great to know I don't have to do these things. I can just sit here and not do them.
Oh, it's a nightmare. So can I ask you, you when we were talking before, you mentioned sort of your views on adoption itself have sort of shifted from that, pre-coming into the role. But actually, the broader, you mentioned, the inquiry into the ethics and values of adoption, which I think we've never had a social work perspective on that. So often we hear the voices of adopted people, adopters, professionals, but actually, you as a social worker, what's your views on adoption?
Yeah. The British Association of Social Work human rights inquiry into the role of social work in adoption. So social workers need to read it. Yeah. And it's very accessible. And I think, actually anybody at any stage of an adoption journey, however they're affected by adoption, can read and access that. It's not like
a link in the notes.
Yeah. So, it blew my mind. What blew my mind about it was bringing together, because the method they used was to bring together all groups affected by adoption and try to do that. Adopted adults, young people, parents, birth parents, professionals, judges, social workers, and that kind of bringing together totally blew my mind. I think it's really important. Some formative experiences, I've talked like things at work have been formative. How young people have kind of been able to tackle some of their identity stuff before any of the adults around them can even start to grapple with it. But also a big formative experience of mine has been coming across that stuff and coming across like Amanda Borman and Open Nest and her work and some conferences that have in practice kind of tried to do that. Also, Social Work Action Network did something where they brought together different people affected by adoption and did that. I think that stuff has been, that's the future for me of adoption. When we think about like where some parents are now, like unilaterally stopping letterbox contact because they find it difficult to manage emotionally, which I completely understand because it's really difficult to manage emotionally. To a perspective that validates like different perspectives in that wider circle of people that you've brought into by stepping into adoption. Like that's a big deal. That's a big changer for how we could think about this. And I think anybody who's kind of going through a assessment and preparation and matching and things like that in terms of adoption, that is the thing. How are all of these different groups of people who've been affected by this, what are their perspectives? And now you can access that really well. Like there's lots of podcasts on your podcast of adult adoptees talking about their experiences, birth parents, like it's really immediately available. And I think going beyond some defensiveness that might be, because people don't necessarily have clean, easy to digest views, do they? Some of that is challenging. Going beyond that and trying to think like, what is that experience and how can I connect with and validate those people who are connected to me? I think that's really important.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you're saying there, because I think that there was Al and I's generation as adopted parents were the generation of this kind of contemporary adoption where it was the care system, it was effects of the care system, it was a product of the care system that were putting our children to us for adoption. And the government started to realise that it actually changed from the traditional kind of relinquishment, and I use my fingers in there because I know not everybody likes using that word. So therefore, we were the kind of first generation of adoptive parents who were parenting children, and the government realised this and needed to do something about it. But now they're grown up; they can speak for themselves. So, but just going back to that, do you think that parents still have? What is your impression of adoptive parents? Are they the middle class, people who can have children, or is it a different? Are they different people these days?
Yeah, definitely. Like there's a big transformation. I think maybe I can't remember the statistics. It's something like 1 in 10 English adoptive parents are LGBT. I don't know because I think they only gather stats on like whether they're same-sex couples or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's like a distorted picture.
Yeah.
But I think like from adoption support, we work with lots of LGBTQ plus families, and so that picture's changing. But I think there are negatives as well. So there's this fantastic thing. There's access to therapy now via the Adoption Support Fund, which is great. But it comes with like an ideological, like big society approach that's privatized it. And that means that a lot of the expertise that used to sit in CAMS and in local authority adoption teams and in other services about adoption has moved into the private sector. And so when people face like really big struggles, like maybe with forensic CAMS or things like that, like they're hitting those like really difficult clinical thresholds for intervention by the NHS, and the professionals there don't have any adoption knowledge anymore.
Yeah.
So that's I'm really pro the access to therapy. I think the ASF has done brilliant things, but I think now there needs to be a transition to trying to think about how you could fund that. How could you mainstream that? Yeah. Like, how could you mainstream access to therapy and make it sustainable? And how can you mainstream schools knowing about adoption instead of having some private therapists who have some good knowledge, who in some cases are involved and able to advise the school? Like, why isn't that a universal thing? So
I think that's the question that we've been asking for the last 6 years of the DFE, about the sustainability of the money, not the fund, the money that goes into it. You know, how can we make sure that it's there forever and it continues to grow? Because
we've had I was going to say, we've had Mark Owers on. Mark Owers was one of the architects of the Adoption Support Fund, and he's really open and honest and said this was to get money into the hands of the right people to make a change quickly. It was set up in a way that made it this sort of this external fund. He said, but the intention and aspiration had always been to kind of for the local authorities to raise their game and to and some of the best local. I mean, I was at the DFE when they were doing the pilots. And some of the local authorities were doing amazing work. What they used the fund to train all of their social care staff in therapy. So that was it was teaching people to fish rather than giving them nets. But I think it's just become part of the structure now. It doesn't seem like there's, will it continue?
There's a difficulty with that because those local authorities that did that stuck the neck out and took a massive risk. Because they didn't know whether it was going to continue, and they could train people based on a business model, because it is like it's a business that they would then be able to access ASF funds to pay for the therapy that they've trained people to do.
Yeah,
and in every kind of cycle, that's been completely uncertain. Is that going to happen? So that's always a difficult decision. So I think a lot of regional adoption agencies try to hedge their bets somewhere in between, maybe try to train some people, and it's difficult to get a fully resourced, multidisciplinary, trauma-informed, therapeutic-based service when you don't know what's going to happen in the next year. So
do you ever find yourself as in your post-adoption support worker, social worker, sort of going into situations and thinking, I'm not sure we just don't have the resources, because often, a lot of people contact us and kind of say, I'm struggling with this. Can you point us? Some people just feeling that they're not getting what they need from post-adoption support. What's in your toolbox?
This is a difficult one because I think the families that have struggled the most are maybe the most identifiable. So, if I speak to some of their experiences, that's difficult to do. So, and I wouldn't want to disrespect them by doing that.
We would.
But what I would say, of course. What I would say is that that this connects to me to this idea of a drain of expertise from universal services, because what can happen is you can access some therapy from ASF for a period of time. The difficulty is that doesn't touch the sides. Yeah. Even with brilliant therapists, the difficulties are way beyond, require a massive, intensive, multidisciplinary response, and then that expertise is lacking. So all the time in post-adoption support, we're faced with really complex, difficult situations, and a lot of people are at sea. So, I've got basic theraplay skills, an understanding of DDP. I've got, quite a reasonably good knowledge of attachment. And I've got a kind of grounding in kind of non-judgmental, humanistic type approaches. And that's kind of what I work with. So we're kind of thinking on our feet, I adapt that and try to work with it creatively. But I think a lot of the time people are I could have an amazing skill set, but you can't substitute for kind of rundown services. Yeah.
So that's quite a bleak end, isn't it? Does that come that question?
Well, let me change things up a little bit, because
all right, okay.
You seem like the sort of person we can ask almost anything of. If you don't want to answer this question, we'll edit it out. But,
hypothetically.
Well, we could edit it out. We'll see. So I don't know if you've been listening lately, but we discussed a podcast by New Family Social the other month around ethical non-monogamy, and I just wondered, as a social worker, because I've spoken, I did a conversation. I don't know when is that coming out, actually, Al? Just out of interest.
Might be a couple of weeks. But we'll need the way it schedules. That doesn't work like that.
Yes, I know. Okay,
it might already be out. It will be out by the time this. It will be out. It will be out.
So we were contacted by American adoptive parents who are in an ethical non-monogamous setup. But I just wondered, I've done a conversation with them, really interesting conversation. Even Al's mind was just blown. But I just wondered, as a social worker, what your kind of approach to that would be. What's your thoughts?
I happily don't do. I don't assess adopters, which is great because I don't understand. I don't understand how to do that. It's completely it seems I don't know. But I think that in adoption support sense, I think people might panic around that and not know what to do. And I think for a lot of things, people expect you. So if you're LGBTQ plus, in some way they expect you to fit a framework that they know about and understand in a different way. So so you have to be in a relationship that somehow maps onto a heteronormative relationship. So I think that people would face difficulties, and I think they would face inappropriate safeguarding stuff. And I think they would face difficult reactions from schools and things like that. And I think that probably the response they'd get in post-adoption support would be patchy. I hope that they would be able to be open about that with me, and I'd be able to support them with whatever their difficulty is.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point because I imagine, and reflection is an amazing thing, isn't it? So I've spoken to this couple. We discussed the podcast from New Family Social, and on reflection, I think that my panic would be, if I was them, would be this labeling the blame as that for the reason for something going wrong. And I think that that would be I personally believe that would be a typical way of being able to go, well, it's because of this. So I think anybody outing themselves in that way would, like you say, the response would be patchy. I think it would really need somebody who's really open to kind of considering, like we've talked about genders and different kind of family setups and all this sort of stuff, to be able to really understand that and think beyond that.
Yeah, and assessing social workers need to understand why somebody would feel that way about disclosing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm loving this conversation because I can literally see every one of us thinking about every word as we say it. We're like, is this word okay? Is this word okay?
I know it's funny though, because it really is a great opportunity to be open and honest, but also just to make sure that we're talking about it in a respectful way, because I don't want anybody who is in an ethical non-monogamous relationship to think they're doing anything wrong, because I don't see it that way.
No.
I mean, Al and I have had a discussion. It's not that Al thought there was anything wrong with it. It's just it was new to you. You didn't think it wasn't something that you'd been aware of.
I live a very sheltered life.
Clearly, I haven't. Then is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. I mean, I raised it in the office. We were having it. It was like when you leave in the office at 5 o'clock, and I said, "Oh, by the way." Like throwing a hand grenade.
Were you there till 9 after you dropped that bomb?
It was, yeah. It was literally like throwing a hand grenade down the office. There's like people scattering and everyone wanted to get their opinion in. But I think that I think it's good to challenge if you can challenge what does it take to raise a child? What do children need? And it's made me really question all of those things in a really positive way. And but I think you mentioned there, obviously you're not an assessing social worker, so you can speak plainly. I think that those relationships that assessing social workers develop with their applicants are just so critical. And we've had a few recently where it's just not gelled, or people have not got through. And
and that's on traditional things that may have gone wrong in relationships and stuff like that. So if you think outside of that box with a social worker who may not have experienced this before, it's going to be a really that's going to compound the issues with that relationship even further, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ooh. Yeah, because if their framework is attachment, then they're automatically assuming that you need to have this type of relationship, and they're not. Like, you'd think, right, if you have a number of valuable relationships that are kind of healthy and reciprocal, and then that would be really great for a child, because they'd be exposed to lots of different figures who are important in their life, or somebody could just close down and be just within two walls, two people, like how claustrophobic. So you could see a massive benefit from this potentially, but I think a lot of work across the adoption system to kind of understand it as well.
Yeah. I feel like we broke ground tonight. We've spoken about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fascinating book about attachment and culture, and about how attachment is manifest in different cultures. I can't remember it. I think it is called As Simply as That: Attachment Across Culture. And it raises the issue of, in some cultures, for a man to have 2 wives, 3 wives, 4 wives, no one bats an eyelid. Now, I'm not suggesting that, the whole thing about wives and husbands and all of that kind of thing, and, property and all of that. But I do think that, it's, that we need to question, what does it take to raise a child, and not just go, oh, mum and a dad.
Yeah.
It's not 1950.
No, especially because you've just said mum and a dad,
Well, I said it on purpose.
My children have 2 dads, and a mum and another dad. So, it's like there's this kind of, it's just, and I saw something as well. What was it? I think it was last week about, again, that language thing as well, how we refer to things, how we speak about things, the words we use, when we talk about the children that are in my my family, it was actually the conference, and I'm going to mention it, actually. It was somebody at the conference actually put in the chat about we shouldn't be referring to them as our children, and I read it and I thought, okay, so let me think about that before I get on the keyboard and go do. But actually, I think it's only healthy that a child feels that sense of belonging, and they are my children. I know they're somebody else's children as well, but they're also my children. And sorry, yeah. What did you say?
What we're legally responsible for them. So.
Oh, I love my kids. Thank you very much.
I know, but you have to pay the bills when they break things in a restaurant.
Exactly. Yeah, I know.
So, yeah.
But also, the other part of that is that, I've maybe never met all of their biological relatives, but I do feel that they're connected to our family. So as a family, it's not just how, the five of us living our life. There's a much larger kind of wide circle of family out there. We might not see them, we might not have met them, we might not know them, but they're still part of that family. And our children are their children as well. So language is a really important thing, I agree, but sometimes that sense of belonging for the children, they do need that as well.
I'm really conscious that we started off an interview and it just turned into me and Scott talking. But I'm afraid that's just how it goes, really.
Sorry, I was just trying to make a point,
No, it's fine.
Nobody objected to it either, so I must have been talking some sense somewhere. I don't know. Maybe.
It's fine. It's fine. We don't have to apologise. It's our podcast. Nick, really appreciate you coming on, and I feel like we could unpick loads more, and I think that we might get you back on, because if you're willing to come on,
you know what? It's freaky because I was just thinking the same thing.
Yeah, if you don't lose your job, off the back of this,
or your registration,
then everything will be fine. It'll be fine. But, So thank you so much for coming on, Nick. I guess the last question would be: is there anything that you were really hoping that you'd like to get a chance to talk about, and we just didn't ask the right questions?
I think the only thing I haven't talked about is another can of worms, but the whole kind of child welfare inequalities thing. So, like, the fact that there's these massive welfare inequalities in the UK, and if you're living in poverty, you're much more likely to have child protection intervention and child removal, and face those kind of responses, and we're possibly facing more of that with another bout of austerity. That I just think that it's important to situate the work we do in that. So if we're talking about kind of thinking about the connections with birth family, like, we have to appreciate that the experience of kind of sharp end child protection for families in poverty is what it is, and we need to like problematize that and challenge that, and also like validate birth family perspectives. But that's the kind of, there's a whole thing to talk about there, which we haven't probably got time to talk about.
Well, I mean, I'd love to get you back and unpick that, but also in the context of, we're thinking about doing a conference about foster care, and we're thinking about foster care allegations. It was something we were thinking about, but I would really love to do a podcast about allegations, child protection, adoption, because I think that, like you say, that a lot of families, like too many families, find themselves caught up in child protection, adoptive families. And I think you'd be able to offer a unique perspective. So would you come back on and talk about that?
Yeah. Definitely, yeah.
We'd try not to lose your registration for you. We'd keep it anonymous and we'd talk in broad terms, not specifics. But that would be really good, because I think that is an issue for a lot of families, and it's terrifying for a lot of families, isn't it? So,
well, it is. Yeah, you're right. And we've both got personal kind of experience of that. Ours is a bit more extreme than mine, but we'll cover that in a future podcast with Nick. So.
Yeah. So Nick, that's a date. You're coming back, whether you like it or not.
Great.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Nick. Absolutely wonderful. I hope you have a lovely night, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.